First of all, I'd like to thank Bob Prowl for asking to hear a sermon on this topic. As many of you know, I'm a student of theosophy, which is all about comparative religion, philosophy, science, and the arts, and I find this stuff endlessly fascinating. It's about consciousness, human and otherwise. So our topic is how other religions perceive Jesus. There are two ways of approaching this. The teachings of exoteric or mainstream religion tend to be different from the esoteric or more mystical view. I looked at Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam, all of which have an exoteric or mainstream overview, but they also allow their followers some leeway and a right to their own opinions. Some writers began their comments with, well, in general, we don't think about Jesus very much because he's just not in our frame of reference. This is not true of Islam, which has great respect for the man Jesus, but I saw that attitude at some point in the other three religions. It's still clear that in every one of those religions, some people do think about Jesus because he's pretty hard to ignore. There's a lot of evidence for the historical Jesus. It's pretty difficult to make a case that he never existed. And his impact on Western civilization has been mighty. There is a pretty good argument that Jesus was not the founder of Christianity, that his followers, especially Paul, were the founders of the new religion after Jesus died. I'm not a biblical scholar, and I'm not qualified to say more than that, but I think it's a valid argument. We should probably take a quick look at what Christianity has to say. When I first mentioned this to Cindy Duckworth, she laughed and said, "You could get 10 sermons out of what Christians think about Jesus." And she's probably right about that. Given the number of different Christian sects, we could fall down a very deep rabbit hole if we wanted to look at all the details. Some people take the Bible literally and buy all the doctrine. And at the other end of the spectrum, people have a much more nuanced and much more intellectual approach. But I think it's safe to say that in general, Christians believe that Jesus was, if not the divinely begotten Son of God, he was at least more attuned to the divine than most of us are. And he set an example that most of us find hard to emulate. So, what do we find about Jesus in other religions? I'm going to start with Judaism. We all know that Jesus was a Jew, and we all know that he was a controversial one. Christians obviously believe that he was the long-awaited Messiah, and Judaism just as clearly does not believe this. Nor does it believe that he was the Son of God, or even that he was a prophet. He was just a man. Jews do not believe that Mary was a virgin when he was conceived. They do acknowledge the crucifixion, but not the resurrection. So according to Judaism, the true Messiah must be an observant Jewish man descended from King David and be an ordinary human being, as opposed to the divine Son of God. And there are also various events that are supposed to surround the arrival of the Messiah. One of the most prominent ones seems to be that he will usher in the age of world peace. Also, apparently, the world will already be moving toward peace when the Messiah arrives. And he will have a mission. This was new to me. His mission will be to establish Judaism and Judaic laws as the world norm. I don't know that this gets much emphasis in modern Judaism. I only saw one reference to it. It probably got a lot more emphasis back in the day. In the early centuries of the Common Era, most Jews had a lot of respect for Jesus as a teacher. Some recognized him as a rabbi. Some modern Jews refer to him as a rabbi. During those early centuries, Jews might have acknowledged Jesus' supernatural powers and his miracles, but they might also have attributed that power to the devil rather than to God. And as Christianity grew larger and larger, Jews were persecuted more and more often. They killed Jesus, which of course led some people to blame Jesus, not just his followers. These days, there's a pretty wide range of Jewish opinions about Jesus among those who think about him at all, and they're a minority. Modern Judaism gives its adherents pretty wide latitude, not only for opinions about Jesus, but about Jewishness in general. A rabbi named Irving Greenberg has referred to Jesus as a failed Messiah rather than the usual accusation of a false Messiah. The difference is, quote, "A failed Messiah is one who has the right values and upholds the covenant but does not attain the final goal," unquote, which is world peace. A professor at Vanderbilt Divinity School says that just as there's no single Jewish view on most matters, there's no single one on Jesus of Nazareth. Some Jews regard him as a wise rabbi, others view him as a heretic. Some find inspiration in his teachings, others take offense at his claims. She also points out again that a lot of Jews they don't know very much about Jesus or New Testament scholarship. The director of the Midwest director of the American Jewish Committee says that Jesus was a charismatic community leader, deeply troubled by what he saw as the failures of his society, and who spoke eloquently about those failures in the hope of change. I didn't find any snarkiness or negativity in opinions about Jesus, although I did read somewhere that such modern views do exist. My take on Judaism is that it's pretty much a religion of thinkers, so I'm not surprised that I didn't find snark. I wasn't looking for snark. So a British Jew named Clive Lawton has a really interesting essay on a BBC website that looks at Jesus through the eyes of other religions. I'm not going to talk a lot about the first part of his essay, but a lot of it was about being a Jewish kid in Britain and learning about Christianity and some of the things that really struck him. But one of the things that he says about Jesus is that it's fairly easy to see Jesus as a Pharisee from the liberal wing. Now, I had to stop here and ask, what exactly is a Pharisee? The New Testament portrays them as legalistic hypocrites, but that's not how Judaism sees them. It turns out there's not a lot of documentation about them, maybe because one of their aims was to preserve Judaism's oral traditions. They felt those were just as important as the written ones. And they also wanted to influence people to make religion part of their daily life, to be more pious, less worldly, pay more attention to the afterlife. So Lawton says, it's easy to see Jesus as a Pharisee from the liberal wing, probably heavily influenced by the messianic fervor that was current, apparently deeply impressed by John the Baptist, who may have been associated with the Essenes or some other such separatist sect. Jesus was deeply bothered by the temple excesses of the time, didn't want to get involved in the politics, and wanted the people to take themselves seriously as being able to bring about God's kingdom on earth by right living. And that apparently was what the Pharisees had in mind as well. Let's all live our religion, not just talk about it. But apparently some of the Pharisees, their walk didn't match up with their talk, and hence their less than stellar reputation. But in general, modern day Judaism definitely does not revere Jesus, but does, for the most part, he is respected. Muslims, on the other hand, have great reverence for Jesus, even though they don't see him as a divinity. Their own prophet is not considered divine. They seem to revere Jesus as a prophet nearly as much as they do Muhammad. They believe in Jesus' miracles, in which he was the instrument of God, and they acknowledge that he ascended to heaven in his physical body. They don't believe in the crucifixion. Apparently, the Quran states that Jesus was taken up to heaven to save him from that fate. And he will return as a Muslim to sit beside Allah during the judgment and to revive Islam. There's a real sense of ownership there. Islam sees Jesus as a highly important prophet of God, and they believe he was the Jewish Messiah. Never mind what the Jews think. They agree with Christianity that his mission was to establish justice in the world and to bring people together in their faith. But still, he was just a man. So Islam sees God as a unity. He is separate from us humans, but he's a unity. So there is no divine Son of God, because that would imply a division in that unity. Islam doesn't have the idea of original sin, so there's nothing that a prophet needs to save us from. There's no vicarious atonement, no letting people off the hook because Jesus died for their sins. We're all responsible for our own behavior. Muslims also revere Mary. The Quran says she was a virgin before that miraculous conception, and her conversation with Allah is recorded in the Quran. According to one legend, when Muhammad abolished all the images of other gods in the Islam's holiest sanctuary, he spared the statue of Mary and baby Jesus. So on that BBC website, someone named Tarif Khalidi wrote the article, Jesus Through Muslim Eyes. And as I said, it was quite eye-opening for me. He says that about 1/3 of the Quran is made up of narratives of earlier prophets, and Jesus really stands out. Quote, the Quran rewrites the story of Jesus more radically than that of any other prophet, and in doing so, it reinvents him. The Jesus of the Quran is placed inside a theological argument rather than inside a narrative. He's very unlike his gospel image. There's no incarnation, no ministry, no passion. His divinity is strenuously denied. Equally denied is his crucifixion. A Christian may well ask, what can possibly be left of his significance if all these essential attributes of his image are gone? So to depart from Khalidi for a minute, biblical scholars tell us that nothing in the New Testament is nothing in the Gospels is eyewitness. It was all written years or decades after Jesus died. So we don't know how much of what was attributed to Jesus he actually said, or how much of the events described actually happened. We don't know how much of it the early church said, let's put this in there to keep people where we want them to be. Khalidi goes on to say that in the Quran, Jesus is noted over and over as a highly significant prophet. He's the only one described as a miracle of God, the prophet of peace par excellence. And finally, it is he who predicts the coming of Muhammad, and thus, one might say, is the harbinger of Islam. Finally, he notes that the Crusades were a 200-year war between European Christians and Western Asian Muslims, in which the Muslims pointed out the glaring disparity between Jesus, the prophet of peace, and the barbaric conduct of his so-called followers. In the 12th century, there was no doubt whatsoever in Muslim eyes that the true Jesus belonged to Islam. I found this astonishing. I knew that Islam respected the prophets who'd come before Muhammad, but I had no idea that Jesus was venerated to such an extent. Maybe it shouldn't be that surprising given how devout many Muslims are. I know Muslims who are like what seem to be the majority of Christians. They go to the mosque on holy days and they may celebrate holiday rituals, but they don't think about and live their religion on a daily basis. But I seem to think that the greater percentage of Muslims do live their religion. So, of course, they would honor a prophet who lived the way Jesus did. Pardon my voice. I am a little short on sleep, and I've also been rehearsing for a couple of days. So Buddhism also has great respect for the man Jesus, although it disagrees vehemently with much of Christian doctrine. But then Christian doctrine comes mostly from the early church, and as we all know, that the early church did not necessarily practice a great deal of what Jesus preached. I asked a former Buddhist monk I know what the Buddhists think of Jesus, and he said, "We don't think about him," which turns out to mean that this man and his colleagues did not do so, but there are Buddhists who do. Their views aren't all identical, but they do all find him to be extraordinary. He's seen as uncommonly compassionate, generous, self-sacrificing, a very wise teacher, but only a man, not a god. The Buddha was also a man and not a god. Siddhartha Gautama became a Buddha after much struggle and study and a great deal of meditation. So being a Buddha means that you are fully awakened to the real, with a capital R, and you're devoted to teaching this truth to others to end their suffering. This state of being is available to anyone who works at it hard enough. And many people in this tradition believe that Jesus was a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is essentially a Buddhist saint. It's someone who is entitled to nirvana, who's one step away from full enlightenment, but who returns to this earthly life to serve humanity and to work for everyone's enlightenment or salvation. Thich Nhat Hanh is a well-known Buddhist monk I'm sure you're all familiar with. He says the teachings of Buddha and those of Jesus are the same in their essence, and that any differences are artificial, which I guess, trifling or unimportant. And he supposedly has said that when you are a truly happy Christian, you're also a Buddhist. So this puts me in mind of a woman I know who is a past president of the Theosophical Society in America, and who says she is a year 33 Christian. That is, she does her best to practice what Jesus taught, and she doesn't buy the dogma. That's the legacy of the early church. Helena Blavatsky once said that religion always congeals into dogma. And as far as I can tell, she was right about that. So my friend Betty has a pretty esoteric view of Christianity. She doesn't believe in the vicarious atonement bit, and she certainly doesn't other everyone who has beliefs different from hers. I'm pretty sure she belongs to an Episcopalian church. When her pastor approached her about joining after she'd been attending for a while, she told him her beliefs, and I think she said he could live with that. So there she is. But to return to Buddhism, the Dalai Lama is supposed to have said that for me as a Buddhist, my attitude toward Jesus is that he was either a fully enlightened being or a bodhisattva. There it is again. One website noted tremendous convergence between Buddhism and Christianity in the teachings around ethics, compassion, love, and so forth. And then the writer went on to acknowledge the stark differences in doctrine, which may be the result of Christianity having congealed into dogma. It makes me wonder if there are Buddhist communities who have met that same fate, but I'm not knowledgeable enough about global Buddhism to judge that. I found a really interesting article by a Buddhist nun she was raised Christian, wasn't finding what she needed, and she had been practicing Buddhism for more than 20 years when she decided to take another look at the person of Jesus. The first thing she said was that he came across as being much more human than she remembered. Quote, although there is much said about him being the Son of God, somehow that doesn't seem nearly as significant to me as the fact that he's a person, a man of great presence, enormous energy and compassion, and significant psychic abilities. He has a mission to reopen the way to eternal life, and he's quite uncompromising in his commitment to, as he puts it, carrying out his Father's will. She has the impression that Jesus is not all that interested in converting other people to his way of thinking. Instead, he wants to teach those who are ready. She finds it noteworthy that the people who seek him out often, quote, often come from quite depraved or lowly backgrounds. It's quite clear that to Jesus, purity is a quality of the heart, not something that comes from unquestioning adherence to a set of rules. And she notes that his reported attitude during his last hours is one of extraordinarily patient endurance, of willingness to bear the unbearable without any sense of blame or ill will. And she compares this to one of the Buddha's expectations of his disciples, that even if they were attacked and suffered extreme physical violence, having their limbs sawed off one by one, if they gave way to anger, they would not be following the Buddha's advice. So the nun says, a tall order, but one that Jesus clearly fulfills to perfection with, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So she concludes by saying that both Jesus and the Buddha are extraordinary teachers who can show us the way, but we can't rely on them to make us happy or ease our suffering. That's up to us. I know some Christians who would disagree with this. They feel that Jesus has indeed healed their suffering. I think what happened was they made conscious contact with the divine or with Christ consciousness, and because they're Christian, Jesus gets the credit for that. So there's also a meme out there that Jesus was the reincarnation of Buddha. If you're, sidebar here, if you're skeptical about reincarnation, there's some excellent physical evidence for it. documented by a Western psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson. Most of his peers ignored the evidence, or they just refused to look at it. But anyway, Jesus as a reincarnated Buddha is something I've heard of a while ago. So the teachings on reincarnation say that we get a new personality each time around, but we bring some of our traits back with us into our next life. And there's so much similarity between Buddha and Jesus in their attitudes, their teachings, the way they live their lives. There's also a suggestion that Jesus must have spent time in India during those years that are unaccounted for in the New Testament. Of course, we'll never know if that's true, but I know people who think it's likely. Both Jesus and Buddha taught that our personal egos are the source of many of the world's problems, our pride, arrogance, greed, vanity, etc. Eastern religions tend to view these shortcomings as due to ignorance, while Christianity talks more about sin. It's not clear to me whether Jesus viewed them as sinful or whether those who wrote the Gospels put those words in his mouth. And again, that's something we'll never know the answer to. But again, among Buddhists who do think about Jesus, there's a great deal of respect and esteem. There may be a lack of these for Christian doctrine, for the congealed dogma, but the man Jesus is certainly admired. So, Richard Smalley is an author, editor, and speaker for the Theosophical Society. And in one of his talks on either esoteric Christianity or Gnosticism, he remarked on the claim that there is only one God. And oddly enough, it's our God. Now, Hinduism, as you may know, recognizes thousands upon thousands of gods. It looks to me like every force or energy, every trait of nature in the universe is considered a deity. It's all one thing, the cosmos, but it's certainly composed of myriad parts, and each of those parts can be thought of as a god because they are part and parcel of God with a capital G. A common analogy is that each of us humans is a spark in the divine flame, or a biological analogy is that on the spiritual level, each of us is a cell in the body of God. Now, when Hindus talk about God, they're not talking about anything resembling the Judeo-Christian Yahweh. They're talking about what gave birth to the manifested universe. Theosophy calls this the absolute, and the Hindus call it Brahma. The being that is the emanated or manifested universe is called Brahman. So different Hindu sects have different areas of focus, but they agree on most things. One is that diverse opinions about God or about the divine are a very good thing, since by itself any one opinion, in the words of Annie Besant, expresses so small a fragment of the mighty truth. Taking all opinions into account gives us a more complete picture. Hindus also agree that any true spiritual discipline is valid, and the most vital practice is ahimsa, or harmlessness. That is the primary tenet of Hinduism: do no harm. And as any spiritual path teaches, it's also important to practice self-discipline, right conduct, meditation, and self-inventory. So Hinduism in general is a fan of Jesus. Based on his life and his teachings, one website described him as a Hindu saint or a sadhu. Another site says he's much more. He's an avatar, an empowered incarnation sent by God with a specific mission to fulfill God's will on earth, which is to wake us all up. And that may, in fact, be beginning to happen. You know, we have the New Age stuff, which is actually ageless wisdom, but some of us are starting to get it. Yogananda is probably a familiar name to many of you. He's known for the autobiography of a yogi and for founding the Self-Realization Fellowship. He also wrote a book called The Second Coming of Christ, The Resurrection of the Christ Within You. He died in 1952, and this book was published posthumously. And most of the rest of what I'm going to say about Hinduism and Jesus is from here on is from a website that has excerpts from this book. So Hinduism, or Yogananda anyway, seems to get the closest to the esoteric level that lies below the exoteric surface of all the religions. I'm going to give you several quotes here because my paraphrasing is not going to improve on Yogananda. Quote one, "In his little human body called Jesus, was born the vast Christ consciousness, the omniscient intelligence of God, omnipresent in every part and particle of creation. This consciousness is the only begotten Son of God. Quote 2, divine incarnations do not come to bring a new or exclusive religion, but to restore the one religion of God realization. Many are the churches and temples founded in the name of Jesus, often prosperous and powerful, but where's the communion that he stressed, actual contact with God? Jesus wants temples to be established in human souls first and foremost, then established outwardly in physical places of worship. Instead, there are countless huge edifices with vast congregations being indoctrinated in churchianity, but few souls who are really in touch with Christ through deep prayer and meditation. 3, Christ has been much misinterpreted by the world. Even the most elementary principles of his teachings have been desecrated and their esoteric depths forgotten. These have been crucified at the hands of dogma, prejudice, and cramped understanding. Genocidal wars have been fought. People have been burned as heretics and witches on the presumed authority of man-made doctrines of Christianity. How to salvage the immortal teachings from the hands of ignorance? We must know Jesus as an oriental Christ, a supreme yogi who manifested full mastery of the universal science of God union, and thus could speak and act as a savior with the voice and authority of God. He has been westernized too much. So again, no admiration at all for Christian doctrine, but a great deal of reverence for Jesus as a carrier of Christ consciousness. So to wrap up, the theme of this year's Summer National Conference at the TS in America was a shared journey, the heart of the spiritual path. The speakers were a Jewish rabbi, a Buddhist teacher, a Christian mystic, a theosophical teacher who happens to have a PhD in microbiology, a Hindu professor of both physics and comparative religion, and a Muslim imam. There were no disagreements. They all agreed with, final quote from Yogananda, by the science of meditation, known for millenniums to the yogis and sages of India and to Jesus, any seeker of God can enlarge the caliber of their consciousness to omniscience, to receive within oneself the universal intelligence of God, end quote. And another name for this universal intelligence is Christ consciousness. The second coming does not mean the man Jesus is going to come back and magically round up all his saved followers. It means that humanity as a whole is eventually going to evolve into an understanding of Christ consciousness. Supposedly, that's our destiny as a species, although as individuals, we have free will and we can choose whether or not to work toward that goal. It's not likely to happen in our lifetime, but at some point, supposedly, humans are going to get it. We're going to be saved from ourselves because we're going to realize that at the deepest level, we are all one. Thank you for your kind attention.
Visit us at UUSG.org.